I had just settled into seat 2A, my worn cardigan folded across my lap, when the young woman in 2B looked me over from head to toe and said, loudly enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear, "I'm sorry, but you don't belong in first class. There's obviously been some kind of mistake." She waved down a flight attendant, demanding I be moved to coach where, in her words, people like me actually belonged. I didn't argue. I just sat quietly and waited, because I already knew that in about 4 minutes, the cockpit door was going to open, and the captain of that plane was going to walk out, see my face, and stop dead in his tracks in front of every single passenger on board. Welcome back to Betrayal Stories. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because every week we bring you real stories about the assumptions people make and the moments that prove exactly how wrong they were. My name is Eleanor Vance, and this is the story of the flight where a stranger tried to humiliate me out of my seat, and what happened when the entire plane found out exactly who I was. I need to tell you a little about my life before I get to that flight, because none of what happened on board makes sense without understanding where I actually came from. I spent 37 years as a commercial airline pilot, starting in the early years when women in that cockpit were still rare enough that I was frequently the only one in the room during training sessions and safety briefings. I became the first female captain in my airline's history in my late 30s, a milestone that made a small amount of regional news at the time and that I was, and remain, genuinely proud of, though I never spent much energy dwelling on it publicly. I simply wanted to fly, and to do the job well, and the historical significance of my position always felt secondary to the actual work in front of me. I flew for that airline for over 3 decades, logging more hours than I could ever accurately count, training dozens of younger pilots who came up through the ranks after me, several of whom went on to become captains themselves. I retired 6 years ago, at 62, not because I'd lost any love for flying, but because 37 years is a long career by any measure, and I wanted to spend more time with my family while I still had the health and energy to enjoy it fully. One benefit of a long airline career, one that most passengers never think much about, is the travel privileges that come with retirement. Airline employees, including retired pilots, typically retain what's called space-available travel, meaning we can fly on remaining open seats, sometimes in coach, occasionally, when seniority and availability align, in first or business class, generally at little to no cost. It's one of the genuine, lasting perks of a career spent in that industry, and over the years since retiring, I've used it modestly, mostly for family visits and the occasional vacation. The flight in question was one I'd been looking forward to for months. My granddaughter, Sophie, was getting married on the West Coast, and I was flying out for the wedding, traveling on a standby ticket using my retiree benefits, dressed comfortably for a long flight rather than for any particular impression, an old gray cardigan over a simple blouse, comfortable flat shoes, my hair pulled back plainly, carrying a worn leather tote bag that had accompanied me on more flights over the decades than I could possibly count. I checked in at the gate about 40 minutes before boarding, and the gate agent, after checking availability, informed me that a first-class seat had opened up due to a last-minute cancellation, and that given my seniority standing from 37 years with the airline, I'd been cleared for the upgrade. I remember feeling a small, genuine flicker of pleasure at that news, both because first class makes a cross-country flight considerably more comfortable at 68 years old, and because there's a particular, quiet satisfaction in occasionally still benefiting from decades of work I'd put into a career I genuinely loved. I boarded during the priority boarding call, made my way to seat 2A, and settled in, tucking my tote bag under the seat in front of me, arranging my cardigan across my lap, and pulling out a paperback novel I'd been slowly working through for my flight. I want to emphasize that I did absolutely nothing during this process to draw any particular attention to myself. I simply sat down, quietly, the way I imagine thousands of passengers settle into their seats every single day. The woman in seat 2B, who I would later learn was named Whitney Sloan, boarded a few minutes after me, dressed in what I could only describe as aggressively expensive travel attire, a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, a large logo-covered tote bag, and an air of impatience that seemed to precede her by several full steps before she actually arrived at her seat. She glanced at me as she settled in beside me, did a visible double take, her eyes moving over my cardigan, my worn tote bag, my generally unremarkable, plain appearance, and I watched her expression shift into something between confusion and irritation. She didn't say anything immediately, but I noticed her pull out her phone and begin typing rapidly, occasionally glancing back over at me with an expression I recognized, even then, as someone working up to saying something she'd already decided to say. About 10 minutes later, as the rest of the first-class cabin continued boarding around us, she turned to me directly and asked, in a tone that managed to sound both curious and accusatory at the same time, whether I was certain I was in the correct seat. I told her, simply and calmly, that yes, I was in my assigned seat, 2A, and returned to my book, assuming, perhaps naively, that this would be the end of the interaction. It was not. Whitney continued, her voice rising slightly, asking if I understood that this was the first-class cabin, a question that struck me as almost comically unnecessary given that I was, at that moment, seated directly beside her in that very cabin, holding a boarding pass that clearly indicated as much. I told her, still calmly, that I was quite aware of what cabin we were sitting in, and again attempted to return to my reading. This is the point where the interaction escalated in a way I genuinely hadn't anticipated, even having witnessed plenty of difficult passenger behavior over my 37 years in and around commercial aviation. Whitney raised her hand and signaled for a flight attendant, a young woman named Priya who I noticed approaching with the particular, practiced calm that flight attendants develop for handling exactly this kind of situation. Whitney told Priya, loudly enough that I could see several nearby passengers in the surrounding first-class rows turning their heads to listen, that there had clearly been some kind of seating error, gesturing toward me as she spoke, and that she wanted it corrected immediately, because, in her words, this woman doesn't look like she belongs in first class, and I paid a lot of money for this seat to be a certain experience. I want to pause here and describe exactly what that phrase, doesn't look like she belongs, actually meant, stripped of whatever polite ambiguity Whitney might have intended. She was looking at an older woman in a plain cardigan, without visible designer labels, without an expensive watch or jewelry, without any of the surface markers Whitney apparently associated with someone deserving of a first-class seat, and had decided, entirely based on those visual assumptions, that I must have somehow ended up there by mistake, or worse, through some kind of deception, rather than considering the much simpler and, as it happened, entirely accurate possibility that I simply belonged there through means she hadn't bothered to imagine. Priya, to her credit, handled the situation with genuine professionalism, checking my boarding pass calmly, confirming that I was indeed correctly seated in 2A with a valid ticket, and explaining, politely but firmly, that there was no error to correct. Whitney did not accept this answer gracefully. She pressed further, asking Priya directly whether I had paid for my ticket or whether I was flying on some kind of discount pass, a phrase she said with a particular edge of contempt that made clear exactly what she thought about the idea of anyone flying in first class without paying full retail price for the privilege. I remember the cabin growing noticeably quieter around us at this point, several passengers no longer even pretending not to listen, the particular hush that settles over a confined space when everyone present senses a genuinely uncomfortable scene unfolding and isn't quite sure whether to intervene or simply watch. I told Priya, calmly, that I was in fact traveling on an employee benefit fare, as a retired pilot for the airline, information I hadn't planned to share so publicly but that felt, at that moment, like the simplest way to defuse an increasingly uncomfortable situation. This information, rather than calming Whitney down, seemed to embolden her further. She actually laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and said something about how that explained everything, that I was clearly just some old retiree taking advantage of a leftover perk to sit somewhere she felt I hadn't actually earned through paying customer money, and that she found it genuinely inappropriate that airlines let employees clog up seats that paying passengers like herself had specifically paid a premium to enjoy without having to sit next to, in her words, people who don't fit the experience. I want to be honest that at 68 years old, After 37 years of a career I built from the ground up during an era when women in that cockpit were treated with far more open hostility than anything Whitney Sloan was currently offering me, very little about this exchange genuinely rattled me emotionally. I felt, if anything, a kind of tired familiarity, the recognition of an attitude I'd encountered in various forms throughout my entire career, the assumption that a woman who didn't visibly perform wealth or status in the way certain people expected simply couldn't have earned her place through legitimate means. I told Whitney, still entirely calmly, that I understood her frustration, though I genuinely wasn't certain what she believed she was frustrated about, since nothing about my presence in that seat had any actual bearing on her own experience or comfort during the flight. I returned to my book, and Priya, after a brief, tense moment, excused herself to continue with boarding, though I noticed her glance back toward the cockpit door with a particular expression I couldn't quite place at the time. About 4 minutes later, as the boarding process was wrapping up and the cabin crew began their final preparations, the cockpit door opened, and the captain stepped out into the aisle, as is fairly standard practice before a flight, to greet first-class passengers personally, a small courtesy some airlines maintain, particularly on longer transcontinental routes. I recognized him immediately, a man named Marcus Delgado, who I had personally trained as a young first officer nearly 20 years earlier, back when he was still working toward his own captaincy. Someone I hadn't seen in person in almost 8 years, though we'd exchanged occasional emails and holiday cards over that time. Marcus's eyes moved across the first-class cabin as he made his way down the aisle, greeting passengers with the practiced warmth captains typically offer, and then his gaze landed on me, and I watched his entire expression shift, recognition breaking across his face in real time, followed almost immediately by a wide, genuine smile. He said my name, loudly enough that it carried clearly across the now genuinely silent cabin, "Captain Vance?" "I had no idea you were on this flight," and reached down to shake my hand warmly, before turning, still holding my hand in both of his, to address the surrounding passengers directly. He told them, and I remember his exact words because they've stayed with me vividly since that day, that they were sitting beside one of the finest pilots this airline has ever had the privilege of training, the first female captain in the airline's entire history, someone who had personally trained him and dozens of other pilots who now flew commercial routes across the country, someone whose decades of service had quite literally helped shape the safety standards and training protocols that every single passenger on that plane currently benefited from, whether they realized it or not. I watched Whitney Sloan's face during that entire announcement, and I will genuinely never forget the transformation I witnessed. The color drained from her face almost immediately, replaced by a kind of horrified, dawning realization as she understood, in real time, exactly who she had just spent the past 15 minutes trying to have removed from first class, on the grounds that I didn't belong and had somehow snuck my way into a seat through some kind of illegitimate discount arrangement. The cabin around us, which had been tensely, uncomfortably silent throughout Whitney's earlier outburst, remained silent for an entirely different reason now, the particular hush of dozens of people watching someone's arrogance collapse in real time under the simple weight of an actual truth they hadn't bothered to consider. A few passengers actually began, quietly, to applaud, a soft but unmistakable ripple of appreciation that spread across several rows of the first-class cabin, clearly directed at me and pointedly, unmistakably, not at Whitney. E-conversation, full stop, and the fact that it took a captain's public introduction to actually settle the matter said far more about Whitney's assumptions than it ever should have needed to say about my own qualifications to simply exist in that seat. I landed that evening, made it to my granddaughter Sophie's rehearsal dinner with time to spare, and told this story, admittedly with a bit more amusement in the retelling than I'd felt in the moment, to my daughter and a few close family members gathered around the dinner table. My daughter, only half joking, suggested I should have let the confrontation escalate a bit further before Marcus intervened, just to see how creative Whitney's justifications might have become. I told her I thought 15 minutes had honestly been more than generous enough. I think about that flight periodically now, months later, not with any particular anger toward Whitney Sloan specifically, but with a broader kind of reflection about how frequently people make snap judgments about who belongs where, based entirely on surface-level assumptions that have nothing to do with actual merit, effort, or legitimate entitlement to the space someone occupies. I spent 37 years earning my place in cockpits that, for much of my early career, actively resisted the idea that a woman belonged there at all. I certainly wasn't going to feel diminished by a stranger's snap judgment about a cardigan and a worn tote bag, 37 years, and one very well-timed captain's introduction later. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were actually dealing with, I want to hear about it. Tell me your story in the comments below. And if this story kept you hooked from beginning to end, make sure you subscribe to Betrayal Stories so you never miss the next one. We've got a lot more coming, and some of these stories will surprise you just as much as this one did. See you in the next video.